There are of course many attribute directives, and throughout this course we will see different ones. Two we already learned about are ng-class and ng-style. Now, just to quickly refresh how they work, let's add a class to our CSS file here. Let's maybe name it odd. And here I simply want to set the color to red. Now in my template, I want to assign this class if it is odd. So here, of course, I could always assign the class, since we already make sure that this list item list is only displayed if only odd is checked. Still, we could also use ng-class here, like this, and make sure that we assign the odd CSS class, therefore we define it here as a property name, only if the number we currently look at divided by 2 with the modulus sign equals something else than 0, so not equal to 0. That means we have a remainder for this division, which means it's odd. Now we can copy this to the even list, and again I know that this will never be odd here because we already make sure that this is only rendered if we are not displaying odd items. We don't have any odd items in the even numbers array. So just to show how this works, of course we have to check even here. Now you see even numbers are black, odd numbers are red. Again, not super surprising, but just a brief refresher on how ng-class worked. And important, I mentioned it before, the squared brackets here indicate that we are binding to some property on our ng-class directive. Now ng-style was the other famous directive we had a look at thus far. ng-style allows us to also pass an object to some property, which is also named ng-style on the same directive. And here we could simply set the background color and we could set it to red like this. Now it would always be red, but of course we can also set a dynamic value here. So we could simply repeat our check from up here if it's an odd number, in which case I want to give this, let's say, background color of yellow. Otherwise, it's transparent. Now I'll quickly copy this over to our other list. Here, of course, I check if even is basically even, and guess what? I think it will be. And now the even numbers, still no styling at all, and the odd numbers are really ugly now, to be honest. But that means our directives here are working. Now let's build our own ones, because that is something we can do too. Let's start with our own attribute directive. So we already use attribute directives like ng-class and ng-style. It's even easier to understand what they do once we've built our own one. So I want to build a directive which simply highlights an element I hover over, let's say. Of course, I could achieve the same with normal CSS styles, but this is just a good demo. So I will create a new folder and I will name it basic highlight, like this, because in there I'll create a new file, basic highlight, and now directive.ts. So before we always had component files, now this is a new element. It's not a component, it will be a directive, hence the file name. Now in this file, I'll export a class, which I'll name basic highlight directive, again to be descriptive about what this class is. And to make it a directive, just like with a component where we added add component, here we have to add directive. And directive needs to be imported from @Angular core. So make sure to add this import. And we need to pass an object to this decorator to configure this directive. Now, how do we configure a directive? The one thing our directive absolutely needs is a selector. Because remember, we do place directives in our template to attach them to elements. So we need to have some way to give Angular that instruction, and that is the selector. Here, that should also be a unique selector. So typically, here you use a camel case notation to give it app highlight as a selector, or here maybe app basic highlight, like this. Now that would select it by element. Now I want to have this attribute style, so I'm going to wrap this in squared brackets, which means this will now be recognized whenever I add app basic highlight without squared brackets to an element. Now to show this, we need to do something which gives us some visual clue that this is working. So the basic thing is, the most basic use case is we change, let's say, the background color of the element where we attach this directive. For this, we need to get access to the element the directive sits on, and the cool thing is Angular gives us this access. We can inject the element the directive sits on into this directive. And injection is something we'll take a closer look at in the next course module, in the big next course module, which is about services. I can say that much. It basically is an easy way to get access to some other classes without having them to instantiate on our own. We do inject by adding the constructor, which every TypeScript class has. We don't need to write anything in the constructor body for now, but here on the list of arguments, we list a couple of arguments you want to get whenever an instance of this class here is created. And of course, Angular is responsible for creating these instances. So therefore, if we tell it to please give us a specific type of argument, this is what injection is. Angular will try to create this thing we need and give it to us. Well, this thing we need, in this case, simply is a reference to the element the directive was placed on. So an element ref, and this name is totally up to you, but the type is important. The type has to be element ref. You might recognize this from @viewChild. There it also was a reference to some element. Here it is too. Now to be able to use this data in our class here, everywhere in the class, we can use a TypeScript shortcut of adding private in front of it, which will make this both a property of this class, so property element ref, and automatically assign this value, so this instance we're getting, to this property. Now with that, we got access to the element. Now we can use it here in our constructor, for example, access the native element, and then do something with it. Though a better place than the constructor is on init. And just like the component, the directive also has the ng on init lifecycle hook. So here I can therefore add ng on init, and in there we could access element ref, that's the shortcut which automatically gave me this property, access the native element, and there access the style and maybe the background color, and set this equal to green so that we can see something changed. So what we're doing here is we're getting access to the element the directive was placed on, getting access to that exact element, and then we're overwriting the style of this element. Now let's use this directive. To use it, we have to do two things. First of all, like for a component, we have to inform Angular that we have a new directive. Just like with components, it doesn't scan all our files, so it doesn't know. So we have to go to app module, and here in declarations, we have to add our basic highlight directive and also add the import pointing to the basic highlight folder and there to the basic highlight directive file. Now with this we can use the directive in our app since we informed Angular. Now let's use it in our app component HTML file. And here below all our lists, I will simply add a new paragraph, style me with basic directive, something like that. And now to this paragraph I can add app basic highlight, my own selector. We don't need to set any value, and importantly, we don't use square brackets, because as I already emphasized, the directive name is just a selector we set up here. And these squared brackets here are not part of that name, it's part of this selector style, telling Angular, please select it as an attribute on an element. And that's just how we add it here, like an attribute of the paragraph. Now with that, if we save this, we indeed see a green paragraph below our list because our directive is doing its job here, it's styling it. So that's our first basic attribute directive. We can enhance this though.